Welcome to chessopenings.com. Today we're going to take a look at a solid defense to the queen's pawn opening known as the Queen's Indian defense. In this opening, Black's key idea is to restrain White in the center and to develop his pieces quickly and only later launch a counterattack against White's center. Let's take a look. The Queen's Indian is a response to the queen's pawn opening, so Queen's Indian games tend to start with the move pawn to d4. And now, to aim for a Queen's Indian, Black plays knight to f6, and after White's most common play c4, Black plays the move pawn to e6. This setup, which Black is using, is extremely solid here. The goal is to answer White's play knight to c3 with this pin bishop to b4, and this would be called the Nimzo Indian. By pinning the knight on c3, Black gains a grip on this e4 square, which is a critical square, since it makes it difficult for White to complete his expansion in the center with pawn to e4. At the same time, Black remains flexible with his central pawns, so he can always choose between d5 or c5 in these positions, depending on which setup White chooses. The Nimzo Indian has such a great reputation that many players prefer to avoid it with the move knight to f3, which is actually the slight favorite for White in this position. And now Black can play the Queen's Indian with pawn to b6, and this is the starting position of the Queen's Indian. The Nimzo Indian and Queen's Indian are sister openings that were made popular by ideas of Aaron Nimzowitsch, one of the famous chess thinkers of the 20th century. Nimzowitsch proposed that it's possible to play without occupying the center immediately with pawns, but instead to attack it with pieces from a distance. And here, Black's going to be using his pieces in order to restrain White's options. Restraint was also another concept which Nimzowitsch was very fond of. He thought that positional play largely boiled down to taking away options from the opponent. And that's one of Black's key ideas in the Queen's Indian, is to make it more difficult for White to advance his center and only later to attack it. In the Queen's Indian, Black is going to aim his light squared bishop and his knight at this point on e4. And this is in order both to restrain the moves pawn to e4, and also there's this cramping move d4 to d5, which Black is also looking out to prevent. If White plays knight to c3 at any moment, Black will still often use this pin bishop b4 in order to further strengthen his grip over the light squares. Now, in this position, White's most popular move is pawn to g3, and this is known as the classical variation, in which White aims to simply complete his development on the king side in a logical fashion and develop a counterweight across the long diagonal. Essentially, White contents himself for the time being with this more modest pawn duo on d4 and c4, and just focuses for now on completing development. Now, traditionally, Black simply plays bishop to b7, and after these standards move bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, castles, and knight c3, we reach an interesting key position. I really want to devote some time to getting acquainted with some of the rich strategic content of this position. Now, if you were asked what would be the most logical move in this position, you could very easily make the mistake of suggesting the move pawn to d5, and this is not a very good move for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's against the spirit of the opening, which says that Black should be waiting until the most opportune moment to make this kind of occupation moves in the center, these moves which occupy the center with a pawn. He needs to restrain himself from making moves like these until the timing is just right. This is the first thing. But secondly, in the Queen's Indian, there's a very common concept which arises, which is that after the capture or exchange of pawns on d5, Black finds himself with two unique problems here in the Queen's Indian, which is that the bishop on b7 is now hemmed in. And secondly, the c-pawn is on an open file and becomes vulnerable to attack very easily. For example, White often continues bishop f4 in this position, so logical square for the bishop, and it already starts to put an eye on this vulnerable pawn on c7. And sooner or later, Black will want to play c5 in order to free his position and move the pawn to a less vulnerable location. So let's imagine that Black just does this now, as he sometimes has. But this does not really solve his problems, since after the moves d takes c5 now or later, this leaves black with what's called a hanging pawns formation. The d and c pawns are both extremely vulnerable to direct attack. If the pawns were able to just simply roll down the board, they could be an asset. So the hanging pawns formation isn't always bad. But if white can generate quickly an attack on these pawns, it's very possible that black could end up losing material. And it turns out that in this position, for example, we can show some methods which white could use to gain a big advantage against this pawn. Knight to e5, great move here. This would unveil a third attacker on the d5 pawn, and it simultaneously pins the pawn so that the pawn cannot advance. So this is a great move here, this move knight to e5. Of course, at the moment, white only has 3 attackers and black has 3 defenders, so white still needs more firepower. So black maybe, say, continues with this move knight a6, and now white has a wonderful maneuver here, knight to c4, taking advantage of this pin and trying to bring this knight to some square where it's going to be useful in attacking this pawn, perhaps knight e3, for example, putting up the final pressure on this pawn. If it's white to move in this position, and he was able to play knight e3, we would already have serious issue for black in defending this pawn. Perhaps it's not even possible. So black instead has often played this move, for example, queen to d7 here. And now white found this move knight to a5, still finding a way to include the knight into the attack. So just to show that with this move queen d7, the idea is that if knight e3, well, I'm always ready to bring one of the rooks to d8 and bring this next defender to this square. And at the same time, in fact, even more importantly, I'm just ready to play d4. Look at that. The bishop is defended. So in fact, this move knight a5, it increases the pressure on b7, prevents the pawn from moving, and also threatens to capture the bishop and gain the pawn. And of course, white has a big initiative here. Of course, you don't always get such a beautiful attack like this against hanging pawn formations, but it's surprising how frequently the pawns can come under attack in positions just like these. Rolling back to the position after knight to c3, we just showed with this little digression that this move pawn to d5 is not a very good idea for black. In fact, it typically is not a good idea in the Queen's Indian for a couple of the reasons which we just showed. So how does black continue his development here and solidify his grip over the light squares? Well, it turns out that he has the outstanding move knight e4. And with this move, he just directly occupies the e4 square, making it impossible for white to play e4. And most importantly, he has a second idea in mind, which is to use the f-pawn to strengthen his hold over the e4 square. And in this way, he will not be blocking the diagonal of his bishop. There are a lot of ways this position can go, but they are all super solid for black. For example, since white will want to avoid double pawns on c3, the most direct is knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. And now, in order to gain the chance for e2 to e4, white typically plays knight e1, just trying to get rid of these bishops. And after the trade, bishop takes g2, knight takes g2, black finally says, well, I'm willing to play d5 now, why not? I don't have this bishop sitting on b7 anymore. And for black, we can say that his strategy has mostly been successful. The exchange of 2 pairs of pieces and the ability to now gain a reasonable share of the center makes this position just about equal. So, after this move knight to e4, white really needs to put on his thinking cap to figure out how he can set black some new problems here. And one way which has been found to do this is this move queen to c2. And this sets a little trap for black, which is that f5 looks like the natural response here. That's exactly what we said is the goal, and we're solidifying control of this square. However, the properties of the queen and the bishop allow that white is now able to simply play this excellent move, knight e5. And this is because if black tried pawn to d6 in this position, he would quickly find himself in trouble after the move knight takes e4, and pawn takes knight, and now simply bishop takes pawn. And because of the pressure down this diagonal, black will never actually have time to capture the knight. So the net effect of all this is that after this move, knight to e5, white simply has a few attackers on this point on e4, and it's going to be very difficult for black to arrange an appropriate defense of the knight. So he needs to avoid this direct move, pawn to f5, and instead he captures on c3, queen takes c3, and now plays pawn to f5. But white still has in mind one last little factor which he's going to try to use in order to gain an advantage in this position. In addition to still playing for the move pawn to e4, he's also going to count on the fact that eventually the e6 pawn might turn out to be weak if black plays d6 eventually, as he most likely will. So, for example, the main line runs pawn to b3, bishop f6, bishop b2, pawn d6, very natural. What black would like to do in such a position is play knight d7 and then either e5 or c5. However, as we pointed out, there is a weakness left behind on e6. So we have this move, rook a d1, queen e7, and now white just picks up with this aim of knight e1, playing for e2 to e4 at some point, trading off this bishops. And now after bishop takes g2, knight takes g2, knight d7, and queen c2, preparing the move e2 to e4, white is looking forward to some kind of small initiative based on the weakness of the e6 pawn. So you can see that even this far into the game, there is still a battle raging in which white is doggedly trying to pursue this aim of achieving e2 to e4, while black tries to avoid it, or at least trade off a couple pair of pieces and pawns in order to neutralize the effects of this move. So we see that this fight for e4 is the major theme which is holding the entire Queen's Indian together. I hope this video has given you insight into some of the key concepts of the Queen's Indian and insight into a few of the key variations. I highly recommend this opening for players of both colors, as the strategic content of this opening is very rich and it's very solid for both sides. Until next time.